Hello everyone. This is my little mini lecture on Chapter 5, which continues the discussion of biodiversity, but goes more into the interaction between species in an ecosystem, and then also talks about population growth and population control. Now, the book mentions 5 different ways that species interact. You should know those. I'm going to mention a few of them. The first one being predation, or predator and prey. That's probably the most well-known one. Obviously, one animal eats another one. A wolf will eat a deer and so forth. Some raptors will eat mice and small animals like rabbits and so forth. There's an obvious winner and loser. But remember, in nature, it's not really a loser per se, because after all, the wolf tends to eat those that are the older or slower or sicker members of a herd. And so in a sense, by eating the deer, they are in fact sort of doing them a favor, though the deer that gets eaten doesn't really see it as a favor. In fact, they are strengthening the herd. And so by taking out the weak members, they do strengthen the herd, and then the stronger members will be more likely, through natural selection, of course, to pass on their genes and maybe improve the herd, the quality of the herd over time. So remember, there's not a lot of thinking on the part of the animals. They don't think about that. They're not thinking, I'm doing this deer a favor by eating it. But it just usually works out that way, to have that impact as well. Parasites, you probably know already. This is where, one organism benefits and the other really gets hurt in the deal. And if you think of a tapeworm that goes into the human digestive system, it takes away all your nutrition, it makes you sick, but it benefits by it. So that is the typical idea of a parasite, or of a mosquito biting you and maybe giving you a disease. You do not come out ahead, but obviously it does. It gets a meal. Mutualism, there are a few examples in the book of mutualism. And this is when, both species benefit in the deal. And they give you a few examples there. One is of the tick bird, I think it is, that lives on the rhinoceros. And you can, it gets a free house, an impressive house that runs around, that moves for it. Meanwhile, the tick bird, eats ticks and other parasites and insects off of the rhinoceros and other animals as well. So in this case of mutualism, both organisms get an advantage. They're not consciously saying, if I do this, I'll help this other animal and he'll help me. But due to natural selection, they have those traits that allow them to be in this type of mutually advantageous relationship with another species. And then there's also commensalism, which is where one organism benefits and the other one sort of comes out neutral. It's not really hurt and it doesn't really benefit. And it gives the example of some species of orchids and other type air plants that don't need soil to grow, and they may grow up in a tree. And so they get closer to sunlight. They may get away from animals that may eat them. And so they attach to the bark of the tree. And the orchid benefits from this, and as far as we know, as we can tell, the tree really isn't hurt or helped in any major way. So that's an example of commensalism. So you should know all 5 of those methods. I've only gone into detail on a few. Then we get into the idea of population. We've talked about what a population is. And now we go into, how do populations, change over time. One way was through evolution. We see things changing in ways. But how about the population itself, the numbers of a species in a certain area? So it talks about a population's age structure, which is basically just really a graph of, how many are 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, how many are 15 or 20, how much are 30 or 40, and so on and so forth. So it's just looking at the age structure, of a particular organisms. We'll use that later in the next chapter to analyze human populations in various countries. And there are obviously factors that limit population growth. The book talks about the range of tolerance. And a very important graph, that's figure 513 on page 113, that shows you the range of tolerance. Now, some organisms have very narrow ranges of tolerance, and that means if something changes just a little bit in the ecosystem, they may be negatively affected. Like certain species of fish are have a very narrow range of tolerance for the temperature of the water. If the water goes up by a few degrees, they may not be able to live there. And so when we have thermal pollution, when we're putting hot water into a river, it may impact the species that can live there. Power plants, electric power plants, take in cool water usually from a river. They boil it to produce steam. That steam turns a turbine. Then that water that's left over condenses back into water, but it's very hot. And if they put that very hot water back into the river, it may raise the temperature locally right around the power plant, and that may affect species there. So you need to look at a species' range of tolerance. We obviously, as human beings, because of this large brain we have, or at least most of us do, no comment there, we have a very large range of tolerance because we can use technology to increase our range of tolerance. We can make clothing. We can make buildings. We can invent air conditioners and heaters. So obviously we have extended our range of tolerance to be able to live almost anywhere on the earth and even in space because of the brain power that we have. Most species, have a more limited range of tolerance, obviously, and if things change in the ecosystem, whether it's done by nature or it's done by changes that humans do, this can greatly impact their ability to survive. It mentions that there are both S and J curves to human population growth, depending on how fast most species reproduce, so take a look at that. There's the idea of the carrying capacity. And that's basically, how many members of a species can live in an area before, you start degrading the environment. It's the idea of living sustainably. When you go past the carrying capacity of an area, you're probably destroying more of the environment that you would eventually need to support those higher numbers of the population. So something's going to happen. There could be a fall off in population at some point. If we go in and, as we have in the past, kill off predators, like kill off the wolves and coyotes, maybe the number of deer or other animals increases to such a point where there's not enough vegetation to support them, and there will be a die-off where a lot of them may die, get ill and sick and so forth and die, and that population of those deer will change again, will go up and down, maybe as the number of wolves and coyotes go up and down as well. So there are those relationships. And it talks about the exploding population of white-tailed deer. Probably some of you, if not many of you, have lived in areas where this has been an issue. I know that I still have a 64-acre farm in upstate New York. Now that we're back on the East Coast, we may actually use it to vacation to. And there was a great overpopulation of deer. Many people, of course, hunt deer as well, and that's an issue that will come up in the chapter on hunting and our feeling about that and how useful is it for population control. And I know that when we had a garden there, we put up a 6 or 8 foot fence, and it still wasn't high enough. We still had a deer who could, jump over that high fence. And they were probably trying to get at the garden, one, because maybe it was an easy and delicious source of food, but maybe also because there wasn't enough other foliage to support so large a herd, because obviously there were very few predators left in that portion of New York any longer. The deer's only predator really probably was humans, either by killing them by driving into them with a car or by shooting them during hunting season. So look at that idea of the population size and how it changes through various methods. There's also population density, and this is how many are living, per square mile, and that obviously changes over time as well as conditions change in an ecosystem. It mentions that humans are not exempt from population controls. We obviously have had, many things that have changed the population significantly. In more modern times, we've had the AIDS virus, which has drastically changed the population in some countries. in the past, we've had the Black Plague in Europe that killed off a huge portion of the population back in those centuries. And so, however advanced we are not totally exempt. Of course, we do count on science and technology to help us, and sometimes we think we are the master of Mother Nature, but in the end, she always wins, and that's a lesson that was, hard fought and still not well understood by many people as well. Before I talk about succession, which I want to talk about, I want to mention the quote at the end of the book by Sir Francis Bacon, which is relevant to what I just mentioned. He says, "We cannot command nature except by obeying her." So it's not just modern environmentalists who believe this. It was intelligent people throughout history who realized that we have to work with nature and not against it if we want to come out a winner in the end. Okay, one last topic in this chapter, in chapter 5, and that's the idea of ecological succession. And that's how ecosystems change over time. And we discussed two major types, primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is not very common. This is where there's a whole new ecosystem, a whole new environment is created, and we're starting from scratch, really, to build up an ecosystem. So if you think of, let's say, the Hawaiian Islands, where new lava there is now, lava coming up from under the sea that is actually creating another Hawaiian Island, and millions of years from now, there will be another Hawaiian Island. Well, that will be just a bare, island until nature works on it, and wind and water erosion, maybe starts to create some soil, and some plants get a hold on there, maybe through seeds that are dropped by birds, and eventually maybe some animals can get over there, and it will change to where it has a variety of plants and animals over time. But it started out as a bare landscape, and so we don't see that very often. The book gives examples of a parking lot that's left in growth that will come back from basically a bare piece of land, and eventually we'll have some type of ecosystem develop on there. But these are not very common. More common are areas that have been disturbed, that once had a fully functioning ecosystem on them, have been disturbed, and then secondary succession sets in. And there are many examples. The book gives a few. You can think of Mount St. Helens. When that volcano went off, there was an existing biodiverse ecosystem on that mountain and the area surrounding it. It was pretty much wiped away, not totally, but pretty much wiped away. And when scientists studied it, they were amazed at really how short of a time, how few years it took for that ecosystem to come back and be maybe not exactly the way it was before Mount St. Helens exploded, but very close to it. It's amazing if you look at the pictures over time that nature moves in very quickly and starts the rebuilding process of an ecosystem. And we start to see smaller plants and shrubs, and eventually we'll see some shorter trees, and then we'll get to the the larger trees and so forth, and the animals will move back in that were there because they now have an ecosystem that can support them. And so we see this secondary succession, and many times when there was the big fire in Yellowstone. I happened to visit Yellowstone about a year or so, or the same year after the fire, and it was just devastating. There were many areas that were burnt out, and I went back, a number of years later, and find that in many cases it was hard to find the areas that had been fire damaged because nature had done such a good job of secondary succession, of that ecosystem, changing over time and rebuilding and being coming back over time. So that's an important topic, and it shows you how ecosystems change over time, just the same way that organisms change over time as well. And with that, I will leave chapter 5 and see you at the next chapter.